It must be realized, however, that a state of peace and security can only be achieved by our determination, all of us, to be bound by the explicit requirements of peace contained in the Lancaster House Agreement, which express the general desire of the people of Zimbabwe.
Robert Gabriel Mugabe's name carries both celebration and condemnation. To many Africans, he was the liberator who ended white minority rule and reclaimed dignity for the black majority.
People's expectations are high.
Mugabe is going to give people food, houses, farms, money and everything they want.
To others, he was the ruler who crushed opposition, silenced dissent, and presided over economic collapse. His life defies easy categorization. To follow Mugabe's journey is to step into a paradox, one that begins not in Zimbabwe, but in Ghana.
Today, Ghana is a land of the future, and Accra, its capital, a fine modern city.
When Mugabe arrived in Ghana in the late 1950s, he was a young teacher, eager for knowledge and restless with ambition. Ghana was a country alive with hope. Kwame Nkrumah had just led it to independence, making it the first nation in sub-Saharan Africa to break free from British colonial rule. In the streets, on university campuses, and in the markets, the air carried the spirit of freedom. The belief that the liberation of one African nation was tied to the liberation of all was more than rhetoric, it was a call to action. Mugabe absorbed these lessons with zeal. He admired Nkrumah's fiery insistence that Africans must govern themselves and shape their own destiny. He watched how independence transformed the self-confidence of ordinary people, and in Ghana he met Sally Hayfron, a teacher with a strong will and sharp political convictions. She shared his belief in liberation and his commitment to the struggles of the continent. Their marriage was more than a union of hearts, it was also a union of ideals. When Mugabe returned home to southern Rhodesia in 1960, he stepped back into a society rigidly controlled by a white minority. Land ownership, political power, and opportunity were stacked against the black majority. He quickly aligned himself with the rising nationalist movement. Gifted with words, he spoke with clarity and conviction, urging black Rhodesians to claim the freedom that others in Africa were winning. His speeches electrified crowds but unsettled the colonial government. In 1964, he was arrested, beginning a prison sentence that lasted more than a decade. Those years in prison did not break him. Instead, they became years of intense study. Through correspondence, he earned degrees in economics, law, and political science. His fellow prisoners described him as disciplined and somewhat aloof, a man with a sharp intellect who believed history had chosen him for a greater purpose. Prison became his forge, but by the time of his release in 1974, he was no longer just a voice in the nationalist movement, he was ready to lead. The liberation struggle was already raging. From Mozambique, Mugabe took control of the Zimbabwe African National Union forces. It was a brutal war, marked by hardship, sacrifice, and suffering. Fighters endured hunger and disease in the bush. Villagers who supported them risked reprisal from the Rhodesian government, which fought back with force. Yet Mugabe's movement grew stronger. His disciplined style of leadership, combined with his ability to articulate the goals of independence, made him the face of the struggle. International attention turned to Rhodesia. Mugabe insisted that the white minority regime could not last. His words reached global audiences, framing the fight as part of the wider African struggle against colonialism. By the end of the 1970s, war fatigue, sanctions, and international pressure forced the warring sides to the negotiating table. In 1979, at Lancaster House in London, an agreement was reached. Rhodesia would become Zimbabwe, and its first elections would be held under universal suffrage. On the 18th of April 1980, Zimbabwe was born. The independence celebrations in Salisbury, later Harare, were electric. The Union Jack was lowered and the new flag was raised as Bob Marley sang anthems of freedom. Prince Charles was there to mark Britain's reluctant handover. In that moment, Mugabe was the hero of Africa. His first words as Prime Minister shocked many. He called for reconciliation. He asked black Zimbabweans to forgive white farmers and settlers, to see them as partners in building a new nation. The world applauded. Western governments praised his statesmanship. African leaders hailed him as a visionary. And at home, ordinary Zimbabweans believed they were entering a golden age. For a time, it seemed true. Schools opened across the country, and education became accessible to millions. Hospitals and clinics multiplied. Literacy rates rose to among the highest in Africa. Zimbabwe looked like the model of post-colonial success. Yet, beneath this promise, fractures deepened. The most glaring was the rivalry between Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union and Joshua Nkomo. By the early 1980s, the government accused Nkomo's supporters of plotting rebellion in Matabeleland. Mugabe deployed a North Korean-trained military unit, the 5th Brigade, to crush dissent. What followed was a campaign of violence known as Karandi. Thousands were killed, tortured, or disappeared. Villages were burned, families torn apart. The government insisted it was a counterinsurgency. Survivors called it a massacre. It marked the first great scar of Mugabe's rule. By 1987, Mugabe had consolidated power. He merged his party with Nkomo's to form the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front. Becoming executive president, the political opposition was weakened, and Mugabe emerged as the undisputed ruler. As the 1990s unfolded, the glow of independence dimmed. Corruption crept into government institutions. Economic reforms demanded by international lenders hit ordinary citizens hard, with rising unemployment and reduced social services. Opposition voices grew, but Mugabe became less tolerant of criticism. Newspapers were censored, opponents were harassed, and elections became increasingly marred by irregularities. Still, Mugabe presented himself as the defender of Zimbabwe's sovereignty, the man who would never bow to Western dictates. His speeches grew more fiery, casting himself as a soldier still fighting imperialism. The defining issue of his later years was land. At independence, Britain had promised to fund land redistribution, but progress was slow. By the late 1990s, frustration among landless black Zimbabweans reached boiling point. Veterans of the Liberation War demanded that Mugabe act. In 2000, the government sanctioned land seizures. White-owned farms were taken, often violently, and redistributed. Mugabe declared that independence without land was incomplete. Too many Africans across the continent, this was his moment of ultimate heroism. He had dared to challenge the economic legacy of colonialism. But the process was chaotic and deeply flawed. Productive farms collapsed, food shortages spread, and political cronies benefited more than the poor. The economy unraveled. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation, at one point reaching billions of percent. Supermarket shelves emptied, and people carried sacks of cash just to buy bread. International condemnation was swift. Sanctions isolated Zimbabwe from the global economy. Millions fled the country, seeking work in South Africa, Botswana, and beyond. Yet Mugabe remained unbowed. He painted himself as a victim of Western conspiracy, the last defender of African dignity against neocolonial interference. Supporters praised his courage. Critics saw only a dictator clinging to power as his country collapsed. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe's decline was impossible to ignore. Hunger, unemployment, and despair spread. Still, Mugabe endured. He outmaneuvered rivals, suppressed opposition, and continued to win disputed elections. For decades, he seemed untouchable. But in 2017, his time ran out.
Armoured vehicles are patrolling the streets of the Zimbabwean capital Harare this afternoon after the army declared overnight that it was taking control of the country. Robert Mugabe, the 93-year-old president who's ruled Zimbabwe since independence from Britain in 1980, has been confined to his home.
After nearly 40 years in power, Mugabe's own party and military turned against him. Tanks rolled into Harare. He was placed under house arrest. His longtime ally turned rival, Emerson Mnangagwa, seized power. For the first time in decades, Robert Mugabe was powerless.
Fellow Zimbabweans, following the address we made on 13 November 2017, which we believe our main broadcaster, Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, and the Herald were directed not to publicize the situation in our country, has moved to another level. Firstly, we wish to assure the nation that His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and Commander, the Chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed.
His resignation was announced quietly, without the fanfare of his rise. Citizens filled the streets in celebration, not for him, but for his departure. Mugabe spent his final years away from the center of power, a diminished figure. When he died in 2019, his passing was met with a mixture of mourning and relief, respect and resentment. His legacy was as divided as his rule. Robert Gabriel Mugabe's story resists simple judgment. He was the liberator who secured independence, the teacher who expanded education, the visionary who spoke of reconciliation. He was also the commander who oversaw massacres, the leader who crushed opposition, and the ruler who presided over economic ruin. To some, he will forever remain the father of Zimbabwean freedom. To others, he will remain the man who broke a nation. Dust and diamonds lie side by side in his memory. His life reflects the paradox of leadership in Africa, that the hand that frees can also bind, that the dream that inspires can also destroy. Mugabe's legacy is not one of a hero or a villain alone, but of both. And in the telling of his story, the world is reminded that power, once claimed, is never simple, and freedom, once won, must always be guarded.